Here's a sneak peek from today's episode.
Essentially, we are trying to do two things with regard to the markets that we're trying to break into, and that is to connect with people because people ultimately make decisions and to influence their behavior.
Welcome to the Content Amplified podcast, brought to you by Masset. Our goal is to help you get more from your marketing content. Each episode is a 10 to 15 minute interview with industry experts that share amazing insights to help you squeeze as much juice from your content as you possibly can. Here's today's interview.
Welcome back to another episode of Content Amplified. Today I'm joined by Evynn. Evynn, welcome to the show.
Hi, Benjamin. It's good to connect with you.
Yeah. Evynn, I'm excited to have you on the show today. Everything we were talking about before we recorded just rings so true. I'm excited for the audience to get to know you. So let's dive right in. Evynn, tell us about yourself and your background. And then our two golden questions. What do you love about content and marketing?
So, hi, everybody. I'm Evynn McFalls. I am a marketing executive. I've worked with all sorts of different companies, consumer packaged goods, technology, transportation, government, you name it. I've probably worked on it in some capacity. Really, a lot of my origin story begins in social media and public relations, but I eventually actually got my big start. Hockey stick growth in my marketing career was focusing on content marketing. So that's one thing I love about it. Not to give you too many spoilers. Outside of that, I am a scholar, an academic that my research area focuses on digital humanities and rhetoric and composition. So again, another spoiler is I love narrative. I love content. And that brings me to, answering that question is the narrative capacity that we possess. The narrative capacity that we possess is something that is unique to human beings as far as we know. And I have been obsessed with that since childhood. And if there's some way to communicate, to narrativize, to tell a story, I love learning how we do it, why we make the choices we do. I love emergent literacies and narrative and storytelling. And marketing is really a place where we get to experiment, play, and actually influence behavior in a measurable way. So I've always found it extremely interesting, and I love playing in the space all the time, narrativizing and figuring out what works, what doesn't, and what's new, what's next.
I love it. That's awesome. Well, Evynn, for the subject today, what we discussed is operationalizing empathy, content that connects at scale. So even reading that, it was a little hard for me to say. So if you were to give a definition to that title, what would that be? What does it mean to operationalize empathy and scale empathy and connection?
There's so many different ways that you can answer this. I'm going to try to, tighten it up a little bit here, but essentially it's this. I think that we have made tremendous progress as a field in building out tactics for measurement, like attribution, et cetera. We've built out a lot of different technologies that make our jobs, if not easier, simpler to cut through to getting the job done. But I feel that there are some core competencies that sometimes we leave on the table in pursuit of the technology and the tools and all of that. And one of those core competencies, you may not be surprised to hear me say, is really, really focusing on narrative. Now, when I discuss narrative in this context, and really any context, because it's what I care about so much in life, I'm not just talking about storytelling in and of itself just for the sake of doing it. Really, we need to ask ourselves, well, why do we tell stories? We tell stories because they are a vehicle for connection. If we were to get into the neuroscience of it all, storytelling actually helps us to activate our mirror neurons, or it helps other people to activate their mirror neurons. So it helps us to feel connected to them. When we get so caught up in, shipping the assets and measuring, the touch points without really thinking about that narrative, without thinking about that connective tissue between us and the people who we are trying to inform, to educate, to influence, we're essentially missing out on the most important part of the work that we do. Essentially, when we focus so much on, only those quantitative or tactical, aspects of our field, I think that we miss out on the fact that essentially we are trying to do two things with regard to the markets that we're trying to break into, and that is to connect with people because people ultimately make decisions and to influence their behavior. So It's not. So when I talk about narrative, I'm really, really discussing connection. One of the key foundations of effective storytelling, of effective narrative, effective connection is empathy. If you cannot really, really demonstrate a commitment to investigating the perspectives of others, how they feel, what their key concerns are, if you cannot mentalize that there's somebody else on the other side of your marketing, then you are more likely than not to get it wrong more often than not. And so when I speak to this notion of operationalizing empathy, it is really, really situating that curiosity at the heart of everything that you do as a marketer so that you don't miss the point, which I'll just reiterate is to connect with people and influence their behavior.
I love that. So when it comes to connection and empathy, a lot of the times people also, it's synonymous with getting to know someone on a one-on-one basis. It's time intensive, is hard to scale, operationalize, expand. How do you think about that? How do you encourage an organization to empathize at scale and actually increase its ability to do so?
Great question, and I think it's going to vary, in any organizational context. And I'll go ahead and say it right now. There are probably a lot of organizations where I wouldn't use the phrase empathy when discussing this, because they're going to be thinking touchy-feely, and I don't think about it that way. In fact, there's quite a lot of leadership literature out there, for example, that, illustrates that, leaders that focus on connection and empathy are much more effective at driving high performance for their teams and at their organizations. Similarly, marketers who listen well, and that's the thing is listening being the key word there, but marketers who listen well are more likely to say things that matter than those who don't. And so when I think about this concept of operationalizing empathy, it's really take it to the realm of business operations and that P&L. It's really thinking about, I'm going to use the term budget here, but really thinking about how do I add that focus on curiosity and connection into the mix of activities and investments that we make in order to ensure that we are getting inputs from our audience and building that into the iterations of our communications programs. And so that's the 10,000 foot view is, okay, well, take a quick look at your budget and ask yourself, how often am I gathering insights from real human beings and using those insights to inform the content that we're producing, or the channels that we're focusing on, or the feedback that we're sharing with the rest of the organization? For example, when was the last time you as a marketer had a meaningful conversation, for example, with your sales leader about the sales process? And when is the last time that your organization, your sales and marketing organization, had a meaningful conversation, or if not a conversation, some way of gathering feedback from your customers about how easy or not it is to buy from you or to stick with you? And I know that a lot of times we focus on that at the customer satisfaction end, where we're saying, do you like our product and would you like to buy more of it? But what are you leaving on the table when you don't investigate? Well, how did people feel about getting on board with us in the first place, or even investigating our product? How much do you know about how people felt about the process of familiarizing yourself with your brand? I find that a lot of organizations, a staggering amount of them, never ask these questions at all. They just say, okay, these are the tactics, or these are the best practices that we've seen. We feel great about those. They seem to be working. It's not broke as far as we know, so we won't fix it. But I always love asking this question, and it is so annoying to everybody, I'm sure. But how do you know, and who the hell did you ask? Pardon me, if that's not, it's like, what did you ask? Was there a real person that you asked? Or are you just, putting your finger in the air and doing the vibe cast and saying, oh, well, I think it works, then I'm just going to operate on the premise that it does.
I love that. That's so cool. Before we were recording, we were talking through it. And let's say, okay, I've actually talked to customers. I've actually gathered insights, and now I'm crafting the messaging. Sometimes we feel like, okay, I've done my job. I've got the message for everyone. I've tapped into the universal insight. What are your thoughts on that? Is there such a thing as a universal insight and things like that?
No, there's not. So if you have arrived at the perspective that you have found the perfect message for everybody, that universal insight, let me just break it to you very, 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 very harshly here. No, you didn't. No, you won't. And that's a good thing. There are billions of people in the world, and I imagine that there are at least hundreds of buyers for whatever product that you're selling, whatever service that you're offering. They have millions of neurons, if not more, in their brain. They have millions of decisions that they have to make, millions of concerns that they navigate through their lives. How could you possibly have arrived at the perfect headline for everybody in the world? Absolutely not.
If you think that you've arrived at the universally perfect message, you have not. You will not. That's fine. There are lots and lots of people in this world with a variety of different concerns and pressures and factors, experiences that go into how they make decisions. You will never write the perfect headline for everybody on earth or everybody in your ICP, and you had better get that notion out of your head because, again, first of all, if you think that, how do you know and who did you ask? Second of all, I imagine you'd be very embarrassed by the response that you got from people if you did ask, which is probably why a lot of people think that they have arrived at the perfect perspective and then never investigate it beyond that. And finally, this is great news. That the third point is it's great news that there's not a universal perspective, because the fact is, if there was, then anybody who manages to create a new product or a new category or whatever, that means there can be no further competition after that. That means that once somebody arrives at the perfect message, you might as well, pull down your shingle because somebody's figured it out. So we should all be grateful that that doesn't happen. And human beings are dynamic, societies are dynamic. All of that dynamism means that the message needs to change based on any number of factors: what's happening at the time, who are the different stakeholders involved in it, and especially when I think about this in a business-to-business context, or even B2C, the family. There may be a single consumer who's making the purchasing decisions in a family, but they're likely influenced by the people in their family. So if you've arrived at the perfect message, I would ask myself, well, whether it's a small family that you're trying to get to buy some kind of consumer packaged good, or a heavily matrixed organization that has a really, really labyrinthine budget process, whatever the case may be, there are lots of factors that go into that decision, and there are probably potential messages that need to be deployed to a variety of different audiences to move the needle for you. And so, having said all of that, no, you didn't arrive at the perfect message for everybody in the world. That's great. Don't be afraid of that. Be excited by that, because in realizing that that is never going to happen, you now have so much more to play with, because you can think about all of the other factors that are involved in crafting and deploying effective messaging. And instead of getting anxious, which is easier said than done, especially because I know there's the hamster wheel that we all end up on, and there's so much for us to balance and do. But rather than getting anxious, I encourage people to get curious and to really dig their heels in about this particular thing, because I really do believe that companies that fall into the trap of the single perfect message are setting themselves up to sink, especially when we think about this in terms of strategy. Strategy needs to be dynamic as well. Strategy needs to anticipate obstacles. When you've decided that you've arrived at the perfect message, you have effectively decided that you will look no further at external factors that may influence your success, or any number of things. Suppose you did come up with the perfect message for everybody in the world that day. Well, another day is coming.
I love that. I think that's great. So, Evynn, we're getting close to running out of time, but I do have one more question for you. When you are looking at it, right, there's not one perfect message. There's different groups of people, different buyers, different times, different circumstances, especially with your background and your education and research and things of that nature. How do we find the different messages, and how do we segment properly? How do we make sure the best headlines and the best content go to the right people at the right time? What are some of your insights there?
I think that it's very, very important that people operate from a scientific definition of experiments, because people say experiment all the time, but really they're just doing things and then hoping to gather some insight about that, which is kind of scientific, but really, you really need to be thinking about, what is the variable, what is the control, etc. And so some things that you might want to take into consideration are, this is our target audience, or this is our primary target audience, this is our ideal client profile. These are the influencing factors or the buying committee that surrounds them. And I think that that's a fairly safe space to start. And then really using that as the basis for then further investigating, well, what are the actual key concerns of those groups? What are the factors that we really need to investigate to, what are the jobs to be done? What do they care about most? What are they in trouble for at their job if they're trying to get out of trouble about? And I think that's always an important thing to investigate. What keeps them up at night? Focus on that, really thinking about, okay, they walk in their shoes and ask yourself what's making their feet sweat. And prioritize that. I think that is a very important thing to do. But then also, as you go along, really think about, okay, in that budget of audience members that I need to concern myself with, who do I need to emphasize, prioritize? Who do I need to concern myself with more? Who do I need to concern myself with less? And so that's one thing is, make sure that you go into it with a reasonable hypothesis and then use the information that you gather from doing your research, which I'll touch on this in just a moment, but use the information that you gather from your research to change your tactics and to, over the longer term, shift your strategy. I think that's very, very important to take into consideration. And then with regard to this point about research, think both qualitatively and quantitatively. I think that marketing has gone in a direction where we are super, super focused on quantitative insights about, hey, this is where people are clicking, or this is the ad that's performing best. That's great information, but what is your capacity for assessing why certain creatives are performing well and others are not? And what is your capacity for understanding why certain headlines or certain content pieces that are targeted at your different audiences are performing well? What is your capacity for understanding why certain people or, certain segments of your set of ideal clients are moving quickly through your life cycle, whereas other people are moving very, very slowly? And I think the most important thing, and there's so many different ways, one thing, and, if we end up talking again at some point, I would love to, dig into this idea of zero-party data, but I'm just going to leave it to this simple phrase. Yet again, I think that this is the most important thing to remember when operationalizing empathy with regard to customer centrism, which is really what I'm talking about. For those who don't want to use the term empathy, customer centrism is a really, really great way to that's a really great replacement phrase, in my opinion. The phrase that I think that we should all keep in mind with regard to operationalizing empathy is, how do you know and who did you ask? And if you can't answer both of those questions effectively, back to the drawing board.
I love that. That is such a good quote. I can already picture the social media post going out about that. I think that's amazing. Evynn, thank you for your insights. I love your perspective. I love how you look at content and messaging and understanding the customer and their unique needs. This is so great. If anyone wants to reach out and connect with you online, how and where can they find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn. It's just my name, Evynn McFall. So you can also find me at tailor.com.
Love it. And we will link to everything in the show notes below. So for anyone listening, just scroll down and you can click through to Evynn's profile. Evynn, again, thank you so much for the insights and the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Benjamin. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Content Amplified podcast. Please subscribe and leave us a review. And for additional ways to get more out of your content, visit our website at getmasset.com. That's getmasset.com. And tune in next time to the Content Amplified podcast.